Hello everybody and welcome to this session on a decade of the 51%, covering conflict through a gender lens. I'm Annette Young, the host of the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world on France 24, and it actually happens to be the 10th anniversary of our program. It's the only program of its type about women on any global newscaster. I'm thrilled to say that we're actually all here. You might wonder why, but when on Saturday night at 10 p.m. Paris time, there was a sense that at least half of the panellists would not be able to attend. However, luckily, unfortunately enough, the goddesses of peace for the moment allowed my Palestinian friend and panellist, Nivine Sandouka, and her Israeli colleague, Yael Braudo-Bahat, to join us. Then on Sunday morning, we got word of a French pilot union strike, which meant the odds are that Mélina Huet, who's from France 24 and a colleague of mine, and myself would also not be able to attend. But I'm glad to say that regardless of the Iranian or Israeli government or French pilots union, we are here. So, let me introduce my wonderful panellists. Nivine Sandouka, to my right, is a Palestinian feminist and activist who's the Chief of Staff at the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And Dr. Yael Braudo-Bahat is from Women Wage Peace, Israel's largest grassroots peacemaking organisation. Also with us is Mélina Huet, a journalist and filmmaker who for a decade has been covering the push for gender equality. More recently, she's been covering the war in Ukraine for France 24 and also been reported on the Gaza war's impact on the Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank. Now, I'm going to ask all of you to basically listen to what these women have to say, because peacemaking is critical. And peacemaking without a feminist perspective will not guarantee freedom and safety for all. The reason why I have these two women with me particularly was a few weeks after the October 7th attack, I asked the two of them to come forward because as a former Middle East correspondent who spent 7 years in the region, I'm very familiar with the story. And I wanted to give my viewers another voice that wasn't being heard. Now, of course, here we are 6 months on, and at this point I'm going to ask Nivine. We spoke a few weeks after the war began. Since then, thousands of Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including thousands of women and children. Cities have been levelled, dozens of hostages still yet to be released, and now the threat of a possible regional war as Israel and Iran play a dangerous dance. So 6 months on, Nivine, how do you keep the faith?
Wow. Yeah, that's the hardest question I think I'm going to be asked tonight. So first of all, thank you so much for hosting us and for also giving us this podium and this place to talk as a Palestinian, as an Israeli. It's very difficult and it's very hard to have two sides talking together about the need for peace and the need to be working together. So thank you very much for that. How do I keep the faith? I think part of it is in that answer, is in what I just mentioned, is that there are good people on both sides who see things differently and who realize that we deserve a better future for ourselves and for our children. And the fact that there are many Israelis like Yael and others who actually recognize the need to end the conflict and to start with peaceful negotiations is something that gives me personally hope. But at the same time, there's also many Palestinians, and on the other hand, and we all come together as one community that basically is calling for negotiations and a multilateral process that includes multiple countries, that is of course fueled by the international will to solve the conflict. This is what gives me hope. And on a very personal note, I am a person who was born in the 80s, so you can guess my age. But I witnessed the first uprising or intifada in the 80s. My neighbors were killed right in front of me. Soldiers used to come with their huge horses inside my school in East Jerusalem as a Palestinian. Events in Al-Aqsa, in Jerusalem as well. So as a Palestinian, I had a very, very tough childhood. But then in the 90s, something happened. When we suddenly see on TV the Palestinian leader and an Israeli leader shaking hands together, and they're putting their weapons aside, and suddenly it was declared that we have peace. And the days afterwards, I know it's very difficult to imagine, but the days afterwards were like, and we went out to the streets basically throwing flowers and sweets at the Israeli cars and buses that were passing through my neighborhood in East Jerusalem. We started learning each other's languages. We kind of like greeted each other with a smile, and it was possible. Up until, of course, the spoilers in the second Intifada spoiled it all for us. But this is what gives me personally hope, is that I witnessed it, and it is possible. And I have a son who doesn't have an alternative. Our children don't have an alternative, and we don't want our children to keep living in this situation.
Thank you, Nivine. Yael, how hard has it been for you to talk about peace, particularly within the community that you operate in? Sorry for the feedback. Given that your close friend, the Canadian-Israeli peace activist Vivian Silva, was killed on Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7th.
For the past, it has been difficult for years to wage peace in our region, and to talk to Israeli audiences and convince them that peace is not only crucial and necessary, but also possible. And this is what we've done in Women Wage Peace for the last decade, since the initiation of Women Wage Peace. And during the past 6 months, it's been even more difficult. Everyone lost relatives, friends, loved ones. We lost Vivian Silver. She was one of the co-founders of Women Wage Peace. She was a prominent mentor for many of us, including myself, and it was devastating. And but you know, from this agony, from this pain, from the ashes, both literal and ideas, we rise. We have to rise because there is no other option. There is no viable future for our region without peace. And this is Vivian's legacy. This is what she told us to do. She taught us to do when she was alive, and now after her death, her tragic death. And we know that it's possible because we saw that it happened in other regions of the world when women from both sides of the conflict united, and we'll talk maybe about it later. And again, we have no choice. We have no choice. We say it's like when the mother has a sick child, and she has to gather her strength and act. And this is what we do. Our region is wounded, our region is sick, and we're the mothers who need to do something. So this gives me hope, and this is the legacy of Vivian and of many peace activists who died on October 7th. And this is what we do, no other way.
Mélina, as a correspondent for France 24 in Ukraine, and more recently reporting from the occupied West Bank and having reported on the war's impact on the Palestinian community living there, how cognizant are you, or purposely, do you seek out voices of peace, and particularly women's voices when it comes to peacemaking?
Well, when we cover wars, it's going to sound very lame, but it's the truth. We don't really think about peace voices because we're in the midst of a conflict zone, of a war. We don't have the chance to always have people like you, Nivine and Yael, around us. We're surrounded by soldiers and civilians who are most of the time victims. So if you ask me, how do I change the shift, how do I change the paradigm of filming mostly civilians who are most of the time women and children who are victims? Well, I mean, war is just the reflection of reality, just more condensed. So if on a daily basis women are very often victims of violence, well, it's even more the case during conflict. So when I was invited here, I actually thought about, did I actually seek, voices of women who are fighting for peace? The answer, truth be told, was no. I reflected on my own reports and thought, what did I do? Like, who are the women that I've filmed in Ukraine, in Israel, in Palestine? And even though I've been working on gender violence for the past 10 years, I didn't really think about, your kind of people, I was just filming civilians who are enduring hardships. And then I looked back and I realized, without even thinking about it, all the women that I've been filming for the past 2 years, whether in Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Democratic Republic of Congo, they're very strong women. And I have cases, like very specific examples that I want to talk to you about, because these women were so inspiring. So there's Alia, she's a 35-year-old Ukrainian, and she kept on swimming, which was her passion, to defy the darkness during power outage, which was really hard because she told me that she didn't have control on anything at the time, but at least she could control her breath, she could control her movements in the water. And that was like a small thing, but that really made a difference for her. There's Sophie, she's an 18-year-old Israeli refusenik. So for those who are not familiar with the term, refusenik are conscientious objectors who refuse to go to go to the Israeli army to do their military service. She is now in jail. We interviewed her in January, and she said, "I'm going to go there and say I'm not joining the Israeli army as long as there's occupation and what's happening in Gaza right now." I also filmed women who were soldiers in Ukraine. I just went to see this organization talking about how you've got 60,000 women who are female soldiers in Ukraine right now, and they don't have the gear, they don't have the equipment, they don't think about what a female soldier needs. And so they gather all of that, and then I met Shura. She's a survivor. She's a victim, but she's also a survivor. Because she was jailed and tortured in 2014, and now she's a soldier. And this is one of the many, many examples of women that I met along the way. I didn't really seek for these profiles, but they just, showed up and they had something to tell, so.
Yes, of course, Nivine.
Sorry, just to that, I think partly the main challenge I feel that we are feeling like we are facing in media is that there's not enough also seeking of women who are doing the unusual work. That the work that we usually think it's for men, women in politics, women who are leading in civil society, women who are basically trying to call for, who are coming together to do kind of like peace work. It's like we look at women or we cover women as only being the victims or survivors, but not really leaders. And I think this is, especially in our conflict, I think we need to highlight more the women who are in leadership positions, whether they are in official, track one or official government, or whether they are in civil society. But once those women actually get enough coverage and their stories is out there, first of all, they give hope. They give a different perspective. And they also are inspirational, that things can be different as well.
At this point... Just a quick note about your reflection. Thank you for this. We've been actually struggling with this for a decade now, because war and conflict and violence are more attractive to the media. It films better, right? And peace does not, but peace is more crucial. And I do encourage you and other correspondents of war zones, to also pay attention to civil society, to women on the ground, whether in official roles or not, that do this hard work of waging peace, and we're doing it on the ground. We're doing vis-a-vis the public. We go everywhere. I'm talking on Israel, about Israel, everywhere, but it doesn't feel good for TV. So please highlight it.
I just want to talk to you both, Nivine and Yael, because for people outside of the region, the fact that I'm sitting next to a Palestinian who's sitting next to an Israeli is, at this point in time, is seen to be extraordinary. I want to ask you, how often have you met over the last few months, and how difficult and logistically, how do you manage to meet one another? Nivine.
Well, as we say, when there's a will, there's a way. So if we look at the circumstances around us, well, we are unable to physically meet. If I am a Palestinian who lives in the West Bank versus an Israeli who lives in Israel, we're unable to physically meet because simply all the checkpoints have been closed and there hasn't been permits to allow Palestinians and Israelis to meet by the Israeli government. It's a procedure that has been put in place also in Gaza for the past 15 years, creating a total dehumanization of one another. The thing is, with people like us, we choose to, it's a fight, and we choose to take this fight. We are able to meet via Zoom. If I'm in Jerusalem, so I have easy access to meet with my members. And the nature of my work as well, I work with the Alliance for Middle East Peace, which is an alliance of 160 peace-building organizations. Part of it are Palestinian, part of it are Israeli, and some of them are Palestinian-Israeli organizations. So within the nature of my work, it's only natural for us to be the convener and the broker of these relationships, if I can use these terms, but also it's the safe space where the peace builders can come and can talk and can ask the difficult questions. And we have been asking a lot of difficult questions since the 7th of October. We have been affected the most as well. And just to show you how resilient we are in this field, we actually even shifted our way of working corresponding to the needs that we are hearing from peace-building organizations. So yes, when there is a will, there is a way.
Yeah, Al, your thoughts?
So I want to tell about Women of the Sun. Women of the Sun is our Palestinian sister movement. It was established 2.5 years ago, almost 3. And we've been in touch and in very strong partnership since then. On October 4th, just 3 days before October 7th, we marched in Jerusalem together. Hundreds of Palestinian women from the West Bank came into Jerusalem and marched with us, 1,500 women from both sides of the conflict marching together, calling to end the conflict. We also held a rally near the Dead Sea, calling for peace, calling to stop the bloodshed. And for us, this was our reality, working together, meeting together. And yes, since October 7th, we weren't able to meet almost. We can meet when we're invited to present our partnership abroad. 2 of our members, one from Women Wage Peace, one from Women of the Sun, were selected as 2 of the 12 Women of the Year of Time magazine. So they met in Los Angeles. But we interact, we're in contact, in touch every day since October 7th, on October 7th. Our sisters sent us a message, we will not despair, peace will come through our efforts. And this is what we've been doing since we've embarked on a very big project together. So we're doing it, even though there are checkpoints and there are borders, but we keep working together.
Mélina, perception is everything, and you and I have spoken about how things have not changed since World War II when it comes to covering women in war. Because to quote you, and I'm quoting you back, women are systemically used as weapons in wars that are initiated by men, such as when women are raped during conflicts. Are we as female reporters just as equally guilty of perpetuating such biases?
Well, again, I'm going to be very humble and reflect on my own work and all the failures in my own work. Nivine, you talked about how women are always perceived as either victims or survivors. There's also a reality, which is, in most cases, it's like statistically, it's the case. There's a double whammy in every war that we've been covering. And when I say we, I'm also talking about fellow colleagues like in the 19th century, 20th century, and now again, double whammy that when you are used as a weapon of war and you are being raped very often by your own community, you're being rejected as a collaborator. So this exists and we can't deny that it exists, and we also have to document it because even though I use the term survivor very often because I don't want women to be perceived as only victims, like on the judiciary side, we have to be perceived as victims to actually seek justice. So that's the first thing. And then it's true, we have a responsibility to also talk about peace advocates, which is the reason why I'm so honored to be at this table with you, because it's quite amazing, to be fair, to be sitting right next to you. In the case of Ukraine, that I know most, Israel-Palestine is not a region that I've been covering for so long. But in the case of Ukraine, when we talk about peace, for instance, it's really hard because most people don't want to talk about peace in Ukraine right now. They don't want to because it means that you're sort of giving up 20% of your territory if you do talk about peace right now. And so it's not the time, it's not the place, it's not now. It will happen, but not now. And it's also why it's so hard to find peace advocates right now, because people are fighting for their territorial integrity. But they exist, you know. It's just that they don't work hand in hand with each other. I've actually tried to find organizations like yours who were hand in hand both in Ukraine and in Russia. I've asked a few people, some of them might be in the room right now, some people who are living in Ukraine, and they told me, well, maybe it was the case before 2022, but after the full-scale invasion, these things have just blown and they've just disappeared, so...
Nivine and Yael, coming back to the Middle East, when I had you on my show back in early November, I think it was, or late October rather, you talked about the need to cover the third voice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if I could perhaps just prompt you again, Nivine, what did you tell me when I asked you as a journalist, you know, about the fact that it's such a polarizing conflict? It has been oversaturated in terms of media coverage, that it's very hard for journalists to turn up with a blank slate. We all go there with a fixed point of view, but we still fail in a way because we don't cover all of the many nuances and the many voices. That's my prompt.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Like ever since the 7th of October, we call our work in peace building, we call it the third narrative. That it's not only you have to be a pro-Palestinian or a pro-Israeli. Choosing a side somehow totally dehumanizes the other one. And we keep kind of like falling in the same cycle of violence once you start dehumanizing the other. The third narrative is kind of like exactly what it means to be pro-peace, pro-humanity, and kind of like pro-negotiations and everything else that brings the two sides together, which I think is exactly the feminist approach that we are talking about. Instead of taking this side and being biased to it, or taking that side and being biased to it, I'm not denying the injustices that are happening, but I'm saying that we also need to have a vision for our future, which is the third narrative that we are talking about, pro-peace narrative.
Yeah, this is where the international community becomes key, doesn't it? At the moment this week you've got the G7 foreign ministers meeting. When they issue those communiques, I don't think I've ever seen one talking about the role of peacemakers in, you know, the civic society. And this is where the international community has failed, has it not?
Absolutely. It's crucial that the international community supports our cause because, and then specifically the G7, which I think convenes later, I don't remember exactly when, here in Italy, in June, right, thank you. So the issue of the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was hardly on the table for the G7. It's probably going to be there this time. And what we urge the international community to do, and the G7, which are very influential, is bring in our voices, bring in the voices of peace, because we know that in our region, and as Nivine said, you can hear the pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian narratives all around the world and in the region as well. But the fact is, the reality is that both people are there to stay. I hear there to stay, and we need to find a way to live together. And the international community has a crucial role in this, in several, I would say, several aspects. First of all, to acknowledge what's happening and promote the peaceful voices, not only the war, and to help fund our civil society peace activism, because usually war is funded, but peace is not funded, is underfunded. And I would say mostly begin negotiations. There is a very good opportunity now because of the tragedy, because of the conflict, because of the war, because of October 7th, because of the hostages and all our other victims. There is a very, very good opportunity now to establish an alliance, a wide alliance, not only in the region, but also in the world, but not only in the West, also in Arab countries, and so many moderate forces that can facilitate and support and initiate peace talks. And I would say, as the representative of a movement, as I said, who works daily vis-a-vis Israeli public cannot even imagine peace now. Okay, it seems unachievable. What we need is the world, the international community, to support and begin negotiations, and then we can show our public that it's possible. Here it begins, it's beginning, and then the peace talks will be more successful. And we need to end this vicious cycle of the world thinking that it's a lost cause, and the people on the ground thinking also it's a lost cause because we're here alone and no one cares about us. So, or they care only about the conflict and the war. So this is what we need the international community to do.
Can I just add to that? Why is it so important? Just before the 7th of October, it seemed that the world and the international community was comfortable with the status quo. 50 plus years of occupation without actually calling for any kind of negotiations. Gaza was under siege for the past 15 years. The West Bank was de facto being annexed. I don't know what was happening in the West Bank, expansion of settlements, and the international community was kind of comfortable with the status quo. What actually happened on the 7th of October is it shook the international community and the world to the core, that managing the conflict the way it was managed so far is not sustainable. And if the international community decides to continue with managing the conflict, the next 7th of October is very soon. So, and it's still ongoing for the past 6 months in Gaza. So right now, what we're calling for is actually to resolve that conflict, to find a solution to that conflict through a negotiated agreement. A two-state solution is the only viable solution for many of the Palestinians and the Israelis, according to statistics. Now, what is lacking? What is lacking is actually true negotiations led by Palestinians and Israelis, but at the same time, if I may use the word, forced by the international community to go into that negotiation process. And the G7 is happening soon in June, and basically in Italy as well. And it's the time, first of all, right now, especially when we saw how the alliance was formed on Saturday to combat Iran, basically. There is such a good chance to bring also the Arabs to the table on the G7 to talk about how we are going to start this negotiation process, a multilateral process that doesn't only include the United States, but also include the Europeans, the Arabs, and other stakeholders as well to start that process. And the one thing that we really need to urge to be different is the involvement of civil society. Imagine if there is a side event on the G7 that basically has civil society leaders from both Palestine and Israel and peace builders talking together and coming up with solutions how the negotiations can start, and then feeding this into the G7, into the leadership of the G7, and later on in the communique. So it's that's exactly what we are calling for, and as peace builders. So hopefully, the international leaders will take this very seriously.
And that's when it comes back to the involvement of women. Mélina, do you think if we had more women in positions of power, that there would be an immediate end to warmongering?
I think the question that we should ask is, if we had more women in power, would we have so many wars to start with? When I was looking at whether such organizations like yours exist in Ukraine or Russia right now, I ended up reading a very interesting article, not from a journalist, from a researcher, about the lack of women in the delegation, the Russian delegation in 2014 during the Minsk agreements. And one of the reasons why this researcher thought that, well, it failed, because it's basically wars declared by men and then peace talks among men, and then you don't hear voices of women who are usually asking for conflict resolutions. But again, it also goes with war is just a reflection of reality, only like stronger. And we were talking about there's an industry of war, there's an economy of war. Is there an economy of peace? Is there an industry of peace? If we do have that, maybe we'll have more interest by male counterparts to actually sit around a table and talk about peace. So it goes with, again, this is a reflection of how this patriarchy is affecting the whole society. So it's war, but it's also civil society, it's peace talks, it's economy of war, economy of peace. It's all of that that's being affected by the lack of a feminist point of view. And when we say that, we don't mean female people, like we don't mean just female, we mean people, women and men who have a feminist agenda. So that's, yeah.
Women leaders or leaders with a feminist perspective, a potential leader with a feminist perspective on either side who has the capability to get people into a room to sit down and talk? Yael?
Absolutely. They're not in the administration currently, unfortunately, but there are many capable women. And they don't need to be only generals, right? With a very big and long military service. They can also be from civil society. We have journalists, we have politicians, we have many women and men with feminist agenda that can promote a wider perspective during the negotiations, because and this is, we didn't invent it, right? The resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council from the year 2000 is based on this notion, on research that found that when women were around the table, they brought into the conversation, into negotiations, crucial perspectives that were missing when only men were around the table. So yes, we need to bring more women around to negotiate, and there are many women who can do that, and the talks will be more inclusive, more productive, the agreement will be reached faster, like what happened in Northern Ireland, like what happened in Colombia, in other regions and conflicts that were resolved over history, and the agreements that are achieved during such processes are long-lasting and more sustainable. So yes, absolutely.
So on the Palestinian side, I would say it's a little bit complicated. There's an intersectionality of both the society itself being a Palestinian Arab society with its own patriarchy, that basically the word feminism is a threat on its own. So you cannot mention really the word feminism, and sometimes you cannot even mention the word gender for your own society, because these are terms that are imported from the West that are not accepted by the Palestinian or the Arab society in general. So it's a little bit difficult on how we kind of talk about it in our own society. Now, definitely, yes, there are leaders with a feminist agenda in the Palestinian society. They are in the civil society. They might be in businesses, but they don't identify themselves as being, feminists per se. But there are, unfortunately, they are not in the decision-making level. That's where the real challenge is. How do we bring this agenda forward to the decision-making level?
And I just want to add that women like us, right? Not an official leadership role in the government, can definitely contribute to the negotiations. And I know that many organizations on both sides, I don't know if many, but some organizations on both sides conduct training for women. So when the day comes, there are many women who can do it.
As I said to you over lunch, with the two of you having been in the region full on for the last 6 months, perhaps you may not realise the extent of public anger that's been directed, particularly at Israel, that it's now increasingly polarised. Some would even go as far as calling it a rogue state, that there is a shift of support, if you like. As a result, the words that you're talking about, the notion of sitting down in a room with Palestinians, how do you bring Israelis to the table and vice versa, the Palestinians as well, the amount of anger and distrust? How do you physically do it? I'll start off with you, Yael.
I don't know how you physically do it, but I do know that the anger and the agony need to be acknowledged. Mm-hmm. We cannot overcome them. We cannot overlook them. They need to be acknowledged. And in our partnership with Women of the Sun, and I'm telling 2 days after October 7, we had a Zoom meeting. We just cried together. This is what we did. And I believe that if we bring together Israelis and Palestinians, acknowledge both sides' pain and agony and anger, then we can begin talking. I can say that on the Israeli side, there is a thirst to hear the optimistic Palestinian or the peaceful Palestinian voices. Before October 7, the leader of Women of the Sun, came to Israel to meet hundreds, thousands of Israelis to voice this message, to meet them, to say, here I am, and there are so many like me. And so it's possible. We need to bring people together.
And Nivine, you were saying over lunch that even public opinion polling in Israel showed that the view has changed.
It has changed. So before the 7th of October, most of the public polling in Israel would show that, the issue of the occupation or the conflict isn't even on the agenda of an Israeli on a daily basis. They would be, focusing more on health issues, education, governance, whatever, but not the occupation, because it was so far away from them. They didn't really realize what was happening in the West Bank with all the settlements, for example, and the settler violence. They didn't really care what was happening in Gaza. It's own, they have their own siege, and they're far away from us. We don't really care. So it was like notion before the 7th of October that, it wasn't even on the agenda. After the 7th of October, a statistic was conducted, I think 2 months into after the 7th, and it showed like more than 90% of those questioned said we needed to find a solution. More than 90%. The devil is in the details. What kind of solution? And that's actually the solution, and that can actually either increase the conflict or decrease it. So, and this is kind of like if you talk about golden opportunities in the midst of a war, I really hate to say that, but this is an opportunity. If more than 90% of the Israelis say we need to find a solution, then where are the leaders who are actually proposing a solution on the Israeli side or on the Palestinian side? I would also just like to go back to that question earlier on, and would fully agree with Yael from a Palestinian perspective. As Palestinians, the one thing that we are asking for is recognition of what happened since 1948 onwards. The narrative, the Palestinian narrative, that part of the recognition, and then the trauma that we've actually carried on, the inherited trauma since 1948 up until now, is something that we wanted to be recognized. Once this recognition happens, and the Israeli narrative as well is recognized, I think we can talk about a shared vision for the future.
Mélina, it's also our responsibility as journalists to make sure these voices are heard.
Yes, absolutely. When I was listening to you earlier on and now, I was just thinking about how we must shift to more what we call solution journalism, which is bringing positive change to the table and bringing very positive people trying to make a change on the front page of our editions, whether newspapers, TV, whatever, instead of only focusing on the things that are horrifying, that are happening, that we have to document. But it's basically, when we cover the war, like 95% of our job, and trying, of course, as you said, Yael, it's less telegenic, it's like less visual to show people who are in an office actually working on peace solutions rather than being in the trenches with soldiers. But we have to do that more and more, and this is also my role, to spread the word that you guys exist. You're not the only ones, fortunately. Yeah, and we have to advertise that as well. I mean, it's really, really important.
Before I open up the floor to questions, and I'm sure there'll be a few, this is obviously going to open up a hornet's nest by saying this, but there are many out there who would argue that the two-state solution is dead. I would start off with you, Nivine. I mean, 50 years from now, where do you hope your children and grandchildren, what sort of world will they be living in? What do you hope, what sort of world they'll be living in?
So let me say this in my personal capacity. I'll get very personal and frank. So when I first joined the peacebuilding camp, that was in 2015, basically I thought I'm joining this camp because I want a one state. I want to live in one big country. It's very small, by the way. You can go from north to south in 8 hours. So it's that small. And basically all live together with equal rights under one government, one man, one voice, one woman, one voice, kind of thing. Democracy and stuff like that. And I joined the peacebuilding camp advocating for that. Now, slowly, actually, coming to know more about the Israeli trauma, the Israeli civil society, the Israeli, aspirations, and also knowing my own people's aspirations and my own people's trauma as well. I think the best solution, also after the 7th of October, is a good divorce. I always like to say it's like a marriage, so basically a two-state solution. A two-state solution that is basically means an end to the occupation, an end to the conflict, but it needs to be also kind of taken a step further that has reconciliation in it between the Palestinians and the Israelis. A lot of faith building and a lot of trust building that eventually, maybe in 50 years from now, we will be living in one state after all.
Yeah, Al.
So, Women Wage Peace, since its initiation 10 years ago, hasn't advocated for any specific solution. This was a very informed decision because we don't need another plan or another solution. There are many solutions now on the table, many plans that were developed over the past 50 or 60 years. There is a two-state solution and the one-state solution and the federation and confederation. What we need now is leaders, courageous leaders who will sit down and begin negotiations, and as I said before, the support of the international community. The right solution for both sides will be the product of negotiations, and this is what we demand. When I envision, if I take your question, what myself or my children in 50 years, first of all, I want them to want to live in Israel, in the region. And for this to happen, we need peace, because there is no viable future for the region or for Israel without peace. And for us, peace is not, sometimes people say you're very naive, you're a dreamer, you're dreaming of an utopia. And no, the answer is no, we're not dreaming of an utopia. We see if the Northern Ireland case for 26 years, just now, they marked the 26th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. They don't like each other. And it's okay. We don't need to like each other. I love my Palestinian sisters. I'm really waiting to see them and hug them, but we don't need to like each other. We just need not to fight, not to kill each other. And we women, we mothers, not necessarily the biological sense, but in the political sense, we want to raise our children to live and not to die and not to kill. That's it. It's that simple.
At this point, I'd like to open the floor to questions. Could you please say your name and the organisation, if indeed you work for one? The lady at the back there.
Hi, my name is Lubna. I'm here in my personal capacity. I was wondering that you talked a lot about peace, but you didn't mention liberation. Where does that come in the peace talks? You mentioned territorial dignity, which is an interesting word for occupation, for Palestinians fighting for their liberation. So I was just wondering, like, as a piece in the puzzle, where does it come in your work?
And the question is directed to whom? Nivine
the
and
peace, the peace building.
Yeah. Okay. Nivine and Yael.
You want to take it first?
I will quote one of my Palestinian colleagues. Our Palestinian colleagues, one of their main challenges is normalization, anti-normalization objections. And one of them once said, when we presented the partnership, she said, people call us normalizers, but we're not normalizers, we're freedom fighters. And when you think of the term freedom fighter in the Palestinian context, you think of something very military. And what I'm trying to say is that, and I don't want to say anything from a Palestinian perspective because I'm an Israeli, but on both sides, we know that the fight for liberation is the fight for peace, because only peace will bring the freedom that both sides need. And we acknowledge everything. We acknowledge, you know, we don't disregard the reality on the ground, but we know that fighting, combating, and killing each other won't result in liberation. It would just result in more killing, in more victims. Fight for peace, that's it.
Nivine.
There's nothing more to add to that, actually, because liberation itself and peace building or peace or negotiations lead to one another. You cannot just say we want liberation, but then how are we going to go to liberation? And peace building and negotiations is one way to liberation. Or you can choose to fight and violence. We're choosing not to fight. We're saying that there is a way to liberation as Palestinians, which is peace building and negotiations and building those bridges with each other.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Great, thanks. Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm a freelance journalist, but I also work on a project with UN Women on women, peace, and security. So I kind of wanted to ask about, you know, we have gender journalism as one kind of beat, we have covering conflicts as another, but you know, you've already discussed kind of this lack of taking a lens of, you know, not only women as victims, but as, you know, peacekeepers, providers of humanitarian assistance. And I think as a journalist, I'm kind of asking myself practically, like, do we need to fuse the two? Do we need to change it? There's obviously the UN resolution on women, peace, and security. That's like having a 25th anniversary next year that everyone at the UN is very excited about. But as journalists, how can we kind of make those connections?
Who are you directing the question to?
Journalist.
I think practically, since, you know.
Exactly.
Well, practically, the difficulty in answering your question is that if we don't change the reality of the things that surround us, how can we report on it? You know, like, are we reporting on the lack of gender equality, or are we it's really hard. I mean, I'm trying to do that on a daily basis, and as I mentioned multiple times today, I think I felt in so many ways also because the environment around me is not very, very, how to put that? It's not helping me in doing so, even though we do have, I think we have to rely on particular stories. We have to rely on particular individuals like Nivine and Yael. I think this is the key to actually broadcasting what they're doing will help sort of incitating other people to broadcast what other peacemakers are doing. And this is how you get something. I mean, I'm very happy with having something that becomes very mainstream, you know. Oh, feminism is mainstream, that's why we talk about it. Fine with me, you know, if it helps, you know, giving more the floor to women, if it gives like more space to people with a feminist spectrum or view of things. Same thing goes with peacemaking process. If we are able to make it mainstream, if we are able to make it very normal and regular, and like people will be like, oh, I want my piece of the cake as well. I want to do that. I want to talk about that because it's it's very popular. I think we have to lead the way and then see how it goes. But
can I just add something to that as a journalist myself who's worked in the industry for a number of decades? The problem, of course, always, as you and I know, Natalie, is format and time. How do you convey an incredibly nuanced conflict like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially at a moment like this where views are so polarised? I would argue, if anything, there is even a greater responsibility on the shoulders of every journalist to make sure that they do convey the multiple shades of grey. It is not black and white. I think for many young people, it's easy to see the world like that, particularly a conflict like that. But, you know, just logistical things like we were talking about over lunch, and having lived there myself, Israel and Palestine is tiny. The distance between Gaza and Ashkelon is minuscule. They are living so closely, side by side, physically, where they can see one another. But you don't see that captured in our news and current affairs reports. The sense is that these are two distant communities. They're not. They live side by side, or in the case of Jerusalem, among each other. Yeah. So that is what the responsibility lies on us to do a better job in amplifying voices like Nivine and Yael and conveying the multiple shades of grey.
And I would add, highlight the opportunities for peace, because as I said, on both sides, it's hard for them to imagine peace, and all over the world as well. So highlight the opportunities for peace so people can start imagining it and work for it. And as you said, personal stories are very powerful. If you talk to peace activists, you can find many motivations. Some are bereaved families. Jonathan, Vivian Silva's son, became a peace activist after the death of his mother. Maoz Inon, who was just featured on TED, became a peace activist after he lost both his parents on October 7th. So highlight those personal stories and highlight peace.
I'm afraid we're being told to wrap it up. So Nivine, do you want to add anything else there to what Yael was saying in terms of what journalists can do?
I think Yael wrapped it up beautifully, but just to remember the core, responsibility of a journalist is to investigate before they start spreading out, news. And we all remember a specific reporter, how she kind of like made the situation a lot worse by putting out a report that was not even, after it was investigated, wasn't even true. So just to make sure that, as journalists, to make sure that you are investigating it, but I would like to add, as Yael mentioned, to make sure that we are also covering the third narrative, not the pro this or pro that, but the third narrative.
I would ask everybody here to give these wonderful women a warm round of applause. Thank you.